At 58, Laura Mercer stood in the middle of her late father's Kansas farm and watched the last dependable source of water disappear. The pond had collapsed into cracked mud, the pasture had turned brown beneath weeks of punishing heat, and the shallow farmhouse well was producing barely enough water for one household, let alone the cattle her father had spent a lifetime raising. Henry Mercer was dead. The farm had little cash left, and every practical calculation told Laura the same thing. Sell the cattle, accept an offer on the land, and return to Wichita before a 240-acre inheritance consumed the retirement she had spent decades building. Her son Ben warned her that sentiment could turn a family legacy into financial ruin. And even Laura wondered why she was still fighting for land she had spent most of her adult life trying to escape. But instead of immediately selling, she made a decision that seemed increasingly foolish. She stayed through the drought and began searching her father's papers for some explanation of how he had expected Mercer Farm to survive without water. People around Red Willow quietly doubted that a 58-year-old payroll administrator who had left farm life decades earlier could save an operation that experienced farmers were already struggling to protect. Then the neighbors began behaving strangely. Earl Dawson repeatedly asked Laura about a barren corner of the north pasture that Henry had refused to plow. Maria Alvarez brought water and would not accept payment. An old well driller started asking about property lines and measurements. And hidden among Henry's farm records, Laura discovered a faded map with one spot in that same north pasture circled in pencil beside 3 unsettling words. Still there? Laura thought it might mark an abandoned well. But professional drilling would cost more than she was willing to risk, and nobody could promise there was usable water beneath the ground. She was preparing to make the decision Henry had resisted for years when, before sunrise one morning, the sound of engines woke her. Laura stepped onto the porch and saw headlights moving across Mercer Farm. Tractors, trucks, trailers, water tanks, and neighbors were gathering in the darkness by the time she reached the north pasture. Men and women who had their own drought-stricken farms to worry about were already clearing ground and preparing to dig around the place her father had marked. Laura had never asked them to come. She had never agreed to become anyone's charity project. Yet when she demanded to know why they were spending their fuel and precious morning hours trying to save a farm that did not belong to them, Earl told her that everyone standing in that field was there because of something Henry Mercer had done years before. And what Laura eventually discovered would change everything she believed about her father. The farm and why it had survived long enough for her to inherit it. But before Earl tells Laura what the people of Red Willow never forgot, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Whether you're starting your morning, taking a break in the afternoon, or listening late at night. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. And if you enjoy emotional stories about family legacies, struggling communities, and ordinary people whose quiet choices come back years later in unexpected ways, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, let's return to Mercer Farm, where the water is running out and Laura is about to discover why her father never plowed that forgotten corner of the north pasture weeks after Henry Mercer's funeral. Laura was still sleeping in her childhood bedroom because leaving Mercer Farm had become more complicated than she expected. Every morning began with heat already pressing against the windows, and by noon the Kansas sky turned pale and hard above fields that looked exhausted. The pond south of the barn had shrunk into a shallow basin of cracked mud. Grass in the pastures had gone brittle. Dust lifted behind every truck that passed the gravel road. At 58, Laura had spent nearly 30 years working in payroll administration in Wichita, where problems usually came with spreadsheets, deadlines, and numbers that could be reconciled. Drought offered none of that comfort. The farmhouse well still produced water, but the pressure had weakened enough that she had begun priming showers and checking every faucet for leaks. The cattle troughs worried her more.
Henry had reduced the herd before his health failed, but the animals remaining still needed more water than the farm could reliably provide if conditions worsened. Ben arrived Saturday morning, carrying groceries and 2 cases of bottled water. At 32, he had Henry's shoulders, but Laura's habit of looking at problems before emotions. "You talked to the feed supplier?" he asked. "Yesterday. And the cattle buyer?" Laura nodded. "If I have to sell part of the herd, I will." Ben leaned against the kitchen counter. "Mom, I know this place means something, but you can't spend your retirement keeping it alive because Grandpa refused to let go." The words struck too close to arguments Laura had made herself during Henry's final years. She had repeatedly urged him to sell part of the 240 acres, pay down expenses, and create some security. Henry always refused. "Land doesn't come back once you sell it," he would say. Laura had heard something else beneath that sentence. "The farm matters more than what you want." "I'm not promising to keep anything," she told Ben. "I'm figuring out what I inherited before I make a decision." That afternoon, Nathan Cole called. He bought and leased agricultural land around Red Willow and had heard Mercer Farm might become available. His tone was respectful, almost casual. If Laura decided not to continue operating it, he would be interested in discussing either part or all of the property. "No pressure," he said. "Just don't let the drought make the decision for you before you know your options." Laura thanked him and wrote his number beside the estate papers. The offer was not yet formal, but simply knowing there was a way out brought equal parts relief and guilt. Near sunset, she walked toward the north pasture. The air still carried the day's heat, though the light had softened over the dry fields. Along the boundary fence, she noticed Earl Dawson standing beside his pickup. At 72, Earl had farmed the neighboring property for most of his life and had known Henry longer than Laura could remember. He was staring not at his own land, but at a rough corner of Mercer Farm where the grass grew unevenly around an old stretch of abandoned fence. "Evening," Laura called. Earl turned. "Evening. Something wrong with the fence?" "No." He looked back toward the corner. "Just thinking." Laura stepped closer. She could see nothing unusual there, except weeds, stones, and ground Henry had never planted despite cultivating nearly everything around it. Earl rubbed a thumb along the brim of his cap. "Your dad ever talked to you about this part?" "What part?" "That corner." "No," Earl seemed surprised. "Not once?" Laura shook her head. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked across the dry pasture toward the neglected patch of ground and asked, "Did Henry ever tell you why he never planted that corner?" By the next morning, Earl's question had become less important than the sound coming from the kitchen faucet. Laura turned the handle and heard air sputter through the pipe before a thin stream of water appeared. She watched it for several seconds, then shut it off. Outside, Ben was already checking the stock tank near the barn. The float valve worked, but the water entered so slowly that several cattle crowded around the trough faster than the well could replace what they drank. "Pressure's worse," he said. Together they checked the pump, exposed fittings and lines for obvious leaks. Ben's experience as a diesel mechanic made him comfortable around machinery, but nothing suggested a simple failure. "Pump's running," he said. "Problem is what it has to pull." Laura looked toward the farmhouse. "How long for the house?" "Hard to say. For cattle at this rate? Not long enough. The pond offered no backup. What remained was brown water surrounded by mud too soft to safely let cattle reach. Hauling water was possible, but Laura calculated the volume, fuel, and delivery costs and felt her stomach tighten. Selling part of the herd was no longer a distant contingency. It was becoming a decision she might have to make within days. Ben followed her into Henry's farm office, a cramped room off the kitchen where old calendars, seed invoices, and maintenance records filled 2 metal cabinets.
"This is what I'm talking about," he said. "You can spend thousands hauling water and still end up selling cattle." "I know." Nathan's interested. "I know that too." Laura opened a folder labeled Wells. It contained pump receipts, pressure tank maintenance, and ordinary service calls, but nothing about the North Pasture. She searched neighboring folders while Ben sorted old property documents. Henry had recorded nearly every repair on the farm, yet there was no explanation for why he had left that corner untouched. Around noon, a pickup pulling a portable water tank came up the drive. Maria Alvarez climbed out and waved before Laura could ask what she was doing. "I heard your pressure dropped." "From who?" "Red Willow is not a large intelligence network." Maria connected a hose and began transferring water into a holding tank near the barn. "This buys you some time." Laura immediately reached for her wallet. "Tell me what I owe you." "Nothing for this load." "Maria, Laura, fuel costs money. Water hauling costs money." Maria tightened the connection. "Then you can argue with me after your cattle drink." Laura disliked the feeling that rose in her chest, not gratitude exactly, but exposure. "I can pay, I know. Then let me—" Maria looked toward the dry pasture. "Henry once told me water isn't something you watch your neighbor run out of." Laura stopped. "When did he tell you that?" Maria turned back to the hose. "A long time ago. Why? Ask me another day. Everybody keeps telling me half of something." Maria gave her a sympathetic look but offered nothing more. After she left, the cattle drank from a full trough for the first time that day. Laura should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt increasingly certain that her father had left behind a history everyone understood except her. That evening, she returned to his office. She emptied the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and found an old property folder wedged beneath tax maps. Inside was a faded survey of Mercer Farm. The paper was soft along its folds, its boundaries drawn years before Laura left Red Willow. Near the North Pasture. Henry had circled a small area in pencil. Laura carried the map to the kitchen and spread it under the light. Ben leaned over her shoulder. "That's near where Earl was standing." Exactly where. Beside the circle were 3 words in Henry's handwriting. Darker than the faded survey lines. No date, no explanation, only a question. Laura read it aloud. "Still there?" Laura called Earl before 8 the next morning and told him she had found Henry's map. There was a pause before he answered. "Meet me at the north gate." Ben drove them across the pasture in Henry's old pickup, following the fence until Earl waved them toward the corner Henry had circled. In daylight, the neglected patch looked even less remarkable. Dry weeds surrounded a shallow depression perhaps 15 feet across. Several stones formed an uneven partial ring beneath the grass, and Ben found 2 rusted pipe fragments half buried near the fence. There was a well here. Earl said. Laura looked at him. "You knew there used to be one? That's different from knowing what's under it now." Earl explained that the well had been abandoned decades earlier. After repeated problems, the opening had eventually been filled and the ground made safe. Henry never planted directly over the site. "Why didn't you tell me that 2 days ago?" Laura asked. "Because an old well doesn't mean usable water. Last thing you needed was somebody promising something that might not exist." Earl had already called Calvin Ross after Laura found the map. Calvin arrived an hour later in a dusty pickup carrying old measuring equipment and the deliberate manner of someone accustomed to disappointing people who wanted certainty. At 64, he had retired from professional well drilling, but he had worked around Red Willow for decades. He walked the depression, examined the pipe fragments, and studied Henry's map. "Could have failed because the casing collapsed," he said. "Could have gone bad because the water level dropped below what they could reach economically then. Could be dry now. We don't know." "So digging this one back out?" Laura asked. Calvin shook his head immediately. "Not how I'd approach it. An abandoned well can be dangerous. and restoring old casing may make no sense. If the geology supports it, you'd drill a modern well nearby and probably deeper. How much Calvin gave her a broad range based on depth, casing, pump equipment, testing, and contractor availability. Even the lower end made Laura uncomfortable. And there's no guarantee. Anyone who guarantees groundwater before drilling is selling confidence, not water. Ben crossed his arms. That's a lot of money for maybe. It is, Calvin said. Back at the farmhouse, Laura searched Henry's office again with a different question in mind. This time she noticed loose pages tucked among planting records. Henry had written dates, rainfall totals, and measurements labeled FT. Some entries were separated by months, others by years. Several referenced north. Ben compared the locations to the faded survey. He was watching this area for what, Laura asked. When Calvin returned later, he studied the pages. These could be groundwater depth notes or measurements from somebody's nearby well. I'd need more context. Henry had apparently tracked them for years without ever telling Laura. That afternoon, Nathan Cole called again. This time he was prepared to discuss a serious purchase price for Mercer Farm. The number was enough to give Laura a clean exit from the drought and the uncertainty of maintaining 240 acres from Wichita. You don't need to answer immediately, Nathan said, but drought changes land decisions quickly. Laura wrote the figure beside Calvin's drilling estimate. One offered certainty. The other required risking money on water that might not be there. Ben looked at both numbers. Grandpa's notes don't make drilling a good investment. I know. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself. Laura closed the notebook. I'm trying not to make a permanent decision because I'm scared of a temporary drought. Temporary can last long enough to bankrupt people. She knew that too. Near evening, Earl returned. Calvin had asked him about county records from older drilling permits and water surveys. Earl believed there might be enough information to determine why the old well had been abandoned and whether deeper formations nearby had produced water historically. Let Calvin check before you sell, he said. Laura studied him. Why does it matter so much to you? Earl looked toward the north pasture. Because your dad thought that ground mattered. That isn't an answer. It's the one I can give until we know whether there's anything worth talking about. Laura felt irritation rise. Everyone seems to know pieces of my father's farm except me. Earl nodded, accepting the accusation. Then he glanced toward Henry's faded map on the table. Your father wasn't waiting for somebody to rediscover an old hole in the ground. Laura. Then what was he waiting for? Earl took his cap off and turned it slowly in his hands. Henry spent half his life waiting to find out if we'd ever need that well again. The drought worsened over the next 4 days. By mid-morning, heat shimmered above the gravel road, and the remaining grass in Mercer Farm's pastures had faded from brown to a brittle gray-yellow. Laura began each day by checking the farmhouse faucet, then walking to the troughs before breakfast. The shallow well still produced water, but slowly enough that every gallon mattered. Maria's delivered tank had bought them time. Not a solution. Laura finally arranged regular hauling from a supplier outside Red Willow. The first invoice arrived before the second load did, and she stared at the figure longer than necessary. Fuel, transport, water, equipment time, added to feed costs and ordinary farm expenses. It was impossible to pretend the drought was simply something to endure until rain returned. She called the cattle buyer and scheduled an inspection of part of the herd. When she ended the call, Henry's old kitchen clock seemed unnaturally loud. Ben found her standing at the sink. You made the call? She nodded. I'm not selling all of them, I know. He would hate it. Grandpa isn't paying the water bill. Laura said sharply, then saw the regret on Ben's face. Sorry, no, you're right. That made it worse. She had spent years telling Henry that preserving the farm unchanged was not the same as protecting the family. Now, less than a month after his death, she was standing in his kitchen feeling guilty for making the exact decisions she had once begged him to make. "He left me with this," she said quietly. 240 acres, cattle, bad water, and almost no room for a mistake. Ben leaned against the counter. "Or he left you land and assumed you'd decide what made sense." "He never decided what made sense." "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean you have to copy him."
Later that afternoon, Calvin Ross arrived carrying photocopies and handwritten notes from historical county well records. He spread them across Henry's dining table beside the faded property map. "This is better than nothing," he said. Several wells drilled in the area over past decades had reached water below the depth of older, shallow systems. The records were inconsistent, and some locations were miles apart. But the pattern suggested a deeper formation might still be accessible near the north pasture. "Might," Laura repeated. "That word keeps getting expensive." Calvin nodded. "It should. Water decisions get people in trouble when hope starts sounding like evidence." He marked a range on the map. A professional driller would still need to assess the location, case the well properly, test flow, and install equipment. When Laura asked for a realistic estimate, Calvin gave her numbers slightly worse than the range he had mentioned earlier because contractors were overwhelmed with drought work. Ben whistled softly. "That could eat a big part of Mom's savings." "It could," Cal said. "And drilling could still disappoint." Laura looked toward the window, where the hauled water tank stood beside the barn. Nathan Cole's purchase offer suddenly seemed less like surrender and more like arithmetic. That evening, Nathan called to confirm that his interest remained firm. He did not pressure her, but he reminded her that market conditions could change if more distressed acreage became available. "You have a clean option," he said. "That matters in a year like this." After the call, Laura walked outside with the property map folded under her arm. From the barn, she could see the north gate in the distance. A tractor sat beyond Earl Dawson's fence, farther north than usual. Nothing about that was remarkable until Maria called the next morning and asked whether the north gate was wide enough for larger equipment. Laura tightened her grip on the phone. "What equipment?" "Just asking, Maria, why?" There was a brief pause. "Calvin mentioned access might matter if anyone needed to get machinery in." "Anyone?" "You should talk to Earl." Laura drove to the north pasture before lunch. Tire marks crossed the dry ground near the boundary, though she could not tell how recent they were. Earl was nowhere in sight. Near the abandoned well depression, the stones and rusted pipe remained as before. Then something bright caught her attention. A narrow wooden stake stood several yards from the depression, topped with fluorescent orange paint. Another stood farther east. A third marked a line toward the gate. Laura walked from one to the next, irritation rising with each step. They were too fresh to have been Henry's. The soil around them had been disturbed recently. She crouched and touched one stake. Survey marks. Someone had been measuring access across her land. When Ben arrived that afternoon, Laura was still standing in the north pasture with the first stake in her hand. "Did you put these here?" she asked. "No." "Did Calvin?" "Not with me." She looked toward Earl's property, then toward the line of orange markers leading back toward the gate. Neighbors had been asking about equipment. Calvin had been studying the old site. Earl had told her to wait before selling. Now someone had marked her property without permission. Laura drove the stake back into the ground exactly where she had found it and stared at the bright orange line cutting across Henry's dry pasture. Someone in Red Willow was no longer merely wondering whether Mercer Farm could find water. They were already preparing for something. Laura found Earl Dawson in his machine shed the next morning, standing beside an old tractor with a wrench in one hand.
She held one of the orange survey stakes in the other. "You want to tell me why this was on my property?" Earl set the wrench down. He did not pretend ignorance. "Calvin and I were measuring access. Without asking me?" "Yes." "And Maria knew?" "Some of it." Laura placed the stake on a workbench, harder than necessary. "You had tractors near my fence. Someone marked a route through the north pasture. Maria asked whether my gate was wide enough for equipment." "What exactly were you planning to do?" Earl removed his cap. "Figure out whether helping was even possible." "Helping with what? Clearing the old site, getting equipment in?"
Maybe preparing for a drilling rig if Calvin's records support it. "You don't get to prepare my land for anything without permission." "You're right." The quick admission took some force out of her anger. "But not much." "Then why did you?" Earl glanced toward the open shed door and the dry fields beyond it. "Because if the access was bad, if the site couldn't be cleared safely, or if the costs were worse than we thought, I didn't want to walk into your kitchen and hand you hope we couldn't afford. So instead, you decided to make plans behind my back. That was wrong." He met her eyes. "But the intention wasn't—" Laura folded her arms. "I am not becoming a charity project for Red Willow." Something changed in Earl's expression. "Charity, yes. I can't afford a deep well. So everybody comes over with machinery and starts rescuing Henry Mercer's daughter. That isn't what this is." "Then what is it?" Earl picked up the orange stake and turned it between his fingers. "Your father hauled water to the Alvarez place one summer when their pump failed. Didn't charge fuel, didn't charge for his time." Laura frowned. "Maria mentioned something about water. There was more than that. Her parents were running cattle then. Henry kept hauling until they got their system working," Earl continued before Laura could answer. "He loaned a pump to another farm during a dry year and went without it himself for nearly 2 weeks. When my shoulder got wrecked in an accident, he worked my acreage after finishing his own days. Wouldn't take $1. Laura knew Henry had helped neighbors. Everyone in Red Willow helped somebody eventually. But Earl was describing something more deliberate. Why didn't he tell me? Because Henry didn't tell stories where he looked generous. That didn't stop him from being stubborn." Earl almost smiled. "No argument there." Later, Maria came to Mercer Farm with another load of water. This time, Laura stopped her before she connected the hose. "Earl told me about your parents." Maria's hands paused on the coupling. "Some of it, probably." "He said Dad hauled water for you? For weeks? For free?" "My father tried to pay him." Henry got angry. Laura let out a humorless laugh. "That sounds familiar." Maria nodded. "Your dad wasn't easy about money when he thought somebody needed help more than he did." As the water began flowing into the holding tank, Maria told her how Henry had arrived before dawn so he could haul a load before working his own fields, then returned after sunset, years later, when another family needed a pump. He loaned his. When Earl was injured, Henry worked extra acres. None of it had been formal. No notes, no debts, no interest. Laura looked at the tank filling with water. "And now everyone thinks they owe him." "No." Maria tightened the valve. "That's not how people here think about it." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because somebody did it when it mattered." Laura hated how close that answer came to something she could not yet name. That evening, Ben arrived after work and found her at the kitchen table with Nathan Cole's offer, the drilling estimates, and the property map spread in front of her. "You look like payroll went bad." Earl admitted the stakes were theirs. "Did you throw him off the property?" "Almost." Ben sat opposite her. Laura told him what Earl and Maria had said about Henry. "I still don't want people spending money on me," she finished. "I can sell. Nathan's offer is real." Ben looked at her for a moment. "Why is accepting help harder for you than selling Grandpa's farm?" Laura stared at him. Those aren't the same thing. Maybe not, but one lets you stay in control. Before she could answer, her phone rang. Calvin Ross's name appeared on the screen.
Laura answered. His voice was unusually sharp with urgency. I found something in the old records. About the well, about Mercer Farm. Something Henry never saw. Laura straightened. What? Calvin paused. You need to see this in person. Calvin arrived at Mercer Farm the next morning carrying a thick envelope of photocopied county records. Earl came with him. But neither man spoke much until Laura, Ben, and Calvin were seated around Henry's dining table. Calvin removed a yellowed drilling record and placed it over the faded property map. The original North Pasture well predates the period when Henry was running this farm, he said. That part we suspected. This is what I didn't know. He laid down several maintenance reports from the drought years of Laura's childhood. One listed emergency pump work. Another documented temporary repairs to a failed water system. Beside the expenses were handwritten names and equipment notes. Laura recognized Dawson immediately. Earl's father. Earl nodded. My dad. There were other family names she remembered from growing up in Red Willow. These people paid for repairs, she asked. Not exactly, Calvin said. Some supplied parts, some supplied equipment, some supplied labor. And while the system was down, water was hauled here. Laura looked at Earl. To us. Yes. The word landed harder than she expected. She had a sudden memory of being a child and seeing trucks in the yard during a brutally hot summer. Men moved hoses between tanks while Henry worked beside them. She had assumed they were contractors because adults came to farms to repair things. She remembered her mother telling her not to play near the equipment. She remembered Henry looking exhausted. I thought Dad hired them. Earl shook his head. Henry couldn't have afforded to. He pulled out a chair and sat. That drought nearly finished this place. The well system failed when everybody was short of water. Your father had cattle to keep alive, bills coming due, and almost nothing left for repairs. My dad and a few others got the temporary system running and hauled water until it held. Why didn't Henry ever tell me? Probably for the same reason he didn't tell you what he did for us later. Laura looked again at the records. The story she had constructed around Henry began shifting. She had spent weeks thinking of him as a man who refused help, clung to land, and believed stubbornness could substitute for planning. Yet there had been a time when Mercer Farm survived precisely because Henry could not do it alone. Did he repay them? She asked. Earl gave a small shake of his head. He tried. Of course he did. My father told him if he had money to spare someday, use it when somebody else needed it. Laura remembered Maria's words. Because somebody did it when it mattered. Suddenly, Henry's later behavior formed a pattern. The water hauling, the borrowed pump he had loaned onward, Earl's acreage after the injury. So all those things Dad did came after, Earl said, not immediately. Not like he had a checklist, but after that drought. Henry stopped treating help like something that had to come back to the same person. Ben had been quiet, reading one of the reports. Mom, you were here when this happened. I was a kid. You don't remember Grandpa talking about losing the farm? No. Laura remembered fear without understanding it, whispered conversations after bedtime. Henry studying bills at the kitchen table. Her parents watching the sky. What she remembered most clearly was that eventually water came from the faucets again and life continued. As a child, she had mistaken survival for inevitability. Calvin tapped the North Pasture map. There's another reason these records matter. They give us better information about the old well's construction and the water levels recorded during those repairs, combined with the later wells drilled around this area. I'm more confident a modern well nearby is technically possible.
Laura repeated. Still not guaranteed. Calvin said, I won't tell you otherwise. He explained that the older system had been limited by depth and equipment available at the time.
A modern contractor could target the deeper formation suggested by historical records and Henry's later measurements. But drought had created another problem. Drilling companies were booked heavily across the region. I spoke to a contractor I trust. Calvin said, there's an opening coming up because another job was delayed. If you want a proper site assessment and a chance at drilling soon, we have a narrow window. Laura looked at Ben. And the cost, still significant. Calvin said, nothing in these papers changes that. Earl leaned forward. Nobody's asking you to gamble everything. Laura glanced at him. You already marked my pasture, and I already apologized. You did. For the first time, she could almost understand why he had done it. Almost. After Calvin and Earl left, Laura carried the old records onto the porch. The hauled water tank stood beside the barn, and beyond it, the fields shimmered beneath another cloudless sky. Ben joined her. You thought Grandpa believed he never needed anybody, he said. So did he, sometimes, maybe. Laura looked down at Earl's father's name on the copied repair sheet. But apparently he learned otherwise before I was old enough to understand. Mercer Farm had not survived that childhood drought because Henry had been stronger than everyone else. It had survived because people had arrived with equipment, parts, labor, and water when he could not afford them. Then Henry had spent decades doing the same for others. Laura turned toward the north pasture. Somewhere beneath that dry ground might be water, but reaching it would require money, professional drilling, and a decision she still had not made. Calvin's warning remained with her. The opportunity would not wait indefinitely. For the first time, however, Laura understood what was truly repeating itself. The drought was not only bringing Mercer Farm back to an old crisis, it was bringing Laura to the same position Henry had once occupied, needing help, hating that she needed it, and running out of time to decide whether she would accept it. The professional drilling estimate arrived 2 days later, and Laura read it 3 times before setting it beside Nathan Cole's offer. The contractor had broken everything into separate costs: rig mobilization, drilling by depth, casing, pump equipment, testing, and the possibility of additional work if the first target failed. Even with Calvin's confidence in the location, the number was more than Laura wanted to risk. Ben studied the estimate at the kitchen table. You can afford part of this, he said. That isn't the same as saying you should, Laura nodded. If I pay all of it and the well fails, I've turned 1 bad decision into 2. By afternoon, Earl arrived with a notebook of his own. He did not ask permission to sit this time. Before you say no, look at this. The list was not money owed. It was equipment people were willing to contribute. Earl had access to a tractor and loader. Maria's family could handle temporary water hauling and provide fuel for part of the site work. Another neighbor could trench a line once the well location was confirmed. Ben could help with machinery maintenance if needed. Calvin had offered his time for planning and supervision without charging his usual consulting rate. At the bottom was a smaller number representing cash several families had volunteered toward professional drilling costs. Laura stared at it. Who asked them for this? Nobody had to ask much. Earl, I told people Calvin found a possible location. They decided what they could give. They have their own drought to deal with. Exactly. Then they need their money. Some need money. Some have machinery sitting part of the day. Some have fuel. Some have 3 hours before they start their own work. Help doesn't always look like a check. Laura pushed the notebook back. I can't take all this. Why? Because I can't repay it. Earl's expression hardened slightly. We already had this conversation. No. You told me what Dad did. That doesn't create a debt I inherit. It doesn't. Then why are they doing it? Because your father did the same when other people were in trouble. And because before that, people did it for him. That still sounds like repayment, only if you think every kindness has to come back to the person who gave it. Laura had no answer. Maria came later with another water delivery, and Laura showed her the contribution list. You're on here twice. Then Earl wrote it down correctly. You're hauling water already. And my brother can run the trencher, Maria. Your own cattle need water. Yes. Which is why we're offering what we can afford, not what we can't. Laura looked toward the dry pasture. What happens if I take all this and the well fails? Then it fails, and everybody wasted time and money? Maria shrugged. People lose time and money in farming every year. That doesn't mean you stop making careful choices. You make it sound easy. It isn't. Maria tightened the cap on the tank. You're afraid accepting help means somebody else owns part of the outcome. That evening, Ben found Laura in Henry's office comparing the drilling estimate, Nathan's offer, and Earl's contribution list. Nathan called, she said. He needs an answer soon. What did you tell him? That I'm still deciding. Ben pulled out the chair opposite her. You could sell. I know. You could also drill. I know that too. Then what's actually stopping you? Laura tapped the contribution list. This, because it makes the drilling cheaper. Because I don't like owing people. Ben leaned back. Grandpa didn't owe them. He thought he did enough to spend decades helping them. Maybe that wasn't debt. Laura looked at him. Then what was it? Maybe that was just how he decided to live after somebody helped him. Ben's words stayed with her. She had spent most of her adult life making sure no one could make decisions for her. Stable job, careful savings, bills paid on time. Independence had always felt like protection. Now it was beginning to look uncomfortably similar to Henry's pride. The next morning, Laura called Calvin. I'm not authorizing drilling yet. Understood, but you can mark the safest location, one location, and I want a complete plan before anyone does anything else. That's reasonable. No surprise work, no machinery on my land without permission. I'll make that clear. Calvin spent the afternoon measuring the north pasture and adjusting the proposed site based on historical records. Access and distance from the abandoned well. Laura followed him for most of it, asking questions about depth casing, contamination risk, and what would happen if they found too little flow. By sunset, a single marked point stood in the dry ground. That's where I'd put the rig. Calvin said, if you decide to proceed. Laura looked at the marker, then back toward the farmhouse. She still had not said yes. Late that evening, after Ben had gone inside, she stood on the porch, listening to the dry wind move through the cottonwoods. In the distance, headlights appeared on the county road, then another pair, and another. Instead of continuing toward town, the vehicles turned onto roads leading toward Mercer Farm. Laura narrowed her eyes. One set of lights belonged to a truck pulling equipment. Behind it came a tractor moving slowly through the darkness. Then another vehicle followed. She stepped off the porch as the line approached the farm road. Several pieces of machinery were coming toward Mercer Farm. Laura woke before dawn to the low growl of diesel engines. For a few seconds, she lay still, disoriented, until light swept across her bedroom wall. She pulled on jeans and boots and hurried outside. Headlights moved through the north gate in a slow procession. A tractor with a loader led two pickups. Behind them came a trailer carrying trenching equipment and another truck hauling a water tank. Laura crossed the yard just as Ben stepped from the barn. "Did you know about this?" she demanded. He hesitated. "I knew people were willing to come. That isn't what I asked. I didn't know they were coming this morning until late last night." Laura stared at him, then headed toward the north pasture. By the time she reached the marked site, Earl was directing a tractor around the abandoned well depression. Maria stood near the gate. Calvin was checking the location he had marked the previous afternoon. Several neighboring farmers were unloading tools. "Stop!" Laura shouted. Engines dropped into silence one by one. Earl walked toward her. "Morning." "No, Earl. Yesterday I specifically said no machinery on my property without permission. You did, and yet here you are. We haven't touched the drilling location." Laura pointed toward the equipment. "That is not the point." Calvin approached carefully. "Nobody's drilling a well, Laura. The contractor still has to do that." "I know how wells work, Calvin." Earl lifted a hand. "If you tell us to leave, we leave. Right now. No argument." Laura looked around. Nobody moved. That somehow made her anger harder to hold. "Then explain what all this is." Earl pointed toward the old site. "Clearing debris around the abandoned area without opening the old well. Improving the access route so a drilling rig doesn't spend billable hours fighting through it. Moving loose rock. Preparing the route where a water line could go if drilling succeeds. Maria brought a tank so you're covered while the work happens. And who authorized any of that? You didn't." Earl's voice remained calm. "We should have asked again." "Why didn't you?" Maria answered from behind him. "Because if we waited until everyone finished their own work, half of us couldn't come." She gestured toward the paling eastern sky. "People have cattle to water, equipment to run, and fields to check. They can give you a few hours before sunrise. That's what they have." Laura recognized faces from Red Willow, people she had seen at Henry's funeral and around town. None looked like rescuers. They looked tired. One man still wore work gloves stained from yesterday. Another had brought his teenage son. Everyone standing there had problems of their own under the same dry sky. "I didn't ask them for this." Laura said, "No." Earl replied, "Henry didn't ask my dad either." Laura looked at him sharply. Earl stepped closer. "Your father never called any of it alone. That doesn't mean the rest of us forgot." The words settled over the field. "So this is repayment?" "No. Repayment would mean the account closes afterward." Earl glanced toward the gathered neighbors. "That isn't how this works." Laura thought of Henry hauling water before dawn for Maria's family, working Earl's acreage, lending equipment, refusing money. Then she thought further back, to the records Calvin had found and the trucks she had seen here as a child without understanding why they came. Henry had once stood where she stood now, needing more than he could provide himself. "You'll stop if I say stop?" she asked, immediately. "And nobody touches the abandoned well itself?" Calvin nodded. "Absolutely not. No drilling. Not without your authorization and the professional crew." Laura looked at Ben. He said nothing, leaving the decision to her. Finally, she exhaled. "Clear the access. Prepare what can safely be prepared. Nothing beyond Calvin's plan." Earl replaced his cap. "That's enough." The engines restarted. Laura stayed. She watched the loader remove fallen limbs and accumulated debris from the route. Rocks were shifted away from the proposed rig access. The trenching equipment was positioned but used only where Calvin had already identified a safe future line. Maria organized the temporary tank, while Ben helped with a stubborn equipment connection. Nobody behaved as though they were performing a miracle. They were simply reducing hours, labor, fuel, and preparation costs that Laura otherwise would have paid a contractor to handle. As the horizon brightened, people began leaving one by one for their own farms. Maria squeezed Laura's arm before climbing into her truck. "Accepting 3 hours doesn't mean you owe somebody 3 hours." Laura managed a small smile. "I'm still learning that." By sunrise, the North Pasture site looked completely different. The old depression remained protected, but the surrounding debris was gone. A clear equipment route ran from the gate toward the proposed drilling area. Calvin walked slowly across the exposed ground, carrying Henry's map and his measurements. Then he stopped near the marker he had placed the previous day. He crouched, checked the alignment against the old well location, and measured again. Laura approached. "What is it, Calvin?" Looked from the historical map to the cleared ground. The debris was hiding part of the old layout. Henry's measurements make sense now. Meaning Calvin drove the marker firmly into the dry soil. Meaning this is it. If you decide to drill.
This is where the replacement well should go. Laura authorized the drilling 2 days later, but only after sitting with Ben and deciding exactly how much of her own money she could risk without touching the savings she needed for retirement. The neighbors' work had reduced the contractor's preparation costs, and their contributions lowered Laura's share further. But the number still frightened her. "This is the limit," she told Ben, circling it on the estimate. "If the well needs more than this, we stop and reconsider." "Good," he said. "Grandpa survived because people helped him. That doesn't mean you have to gamble everything he left." When the professional drilling crew arrived, the cleared access allowed the rig to reach Calvin's marked location without delay. Laura stood beyond the work area with Earl and watched steel disappear into ground that looked incapable of holding moisture. Calvin stayed close to the crew, comparing depth readings with the historical records. The first hours produced dust, cuttings, and increasingly uncomfortable numbers. At a depth where one older record had suggested water, the results were poor. The crew continued toward the deeper formation Calvin had identified. By afternoon, there was still no useful flow. Laura walked back toward the barn, unable to watch every turn of the machinery. Nathan Cole's offer remained on her kitchen table. She could have chosen certainty. Instead, she had spent money because an old map, county records, and people who loved her father had convinced her to try. Earl followed her halfway. "You can still stop. Would you? It isn't my money. That's not what I asked." Earl looked toward the rig. "I'd go to the target Calvin gave us. Then I'd listen to what the ground says." Laura almost laughed. Farmers make dirt sound opinionated, usually because it gets the final vote. She returned to the drilling site. Near the deeper target, the sound of the rig changed. Calvin moved closer to the crew. A few minutes later, damp material came up with the cuttings. Laura saw it before anyone spoke. She refused to let herself believe it meant enough. Then more followed. The crew began testing. Water appeared, cloudy at first from drilling, then with a steadier flow. Calvin watched the measurements rather than celebrating. "Is it enough?" Laura asked. "We need proper testing before I tell you what it can sustain." Hours later, his answer remained cautious. The well was not a miracle and would not support careless expansion, but preliminary flow suggested usable groundwater sufficient for the farmhouse and a reduced agricultural operation, if managed responsibly. Laura turned away and covered her mouth. Ben put an arm around her shoulders. She had expected triumph if water came. What she felt instead was relief so deep it hurt. Earl waited until the crew finished the immediate work before approaching with a small, weathered notebook. "This belonged to Henry." Laura looked at it. "Where did you get that?" "He gave it to me last year when his health was getting worse. Told me to keep it with some old farm records. I didn't understand why until all this started." Laura opened it. The pages contained dates, brief notes, and names she recognized from Red Willow, Alvarez, Dawson, other farms. Besides, some were simple descriptions: water hauled, pump loaned, field finished, cattle moved, repair helped. He did keep records. Laura whispered, "Not debts." Earl said, "Read the front." She turned back to the inside cover. Henry's handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "We kept this place because they kept us first." Laura read the sentence twice.
Suddenly, the notebook was not a record of what Red Willow owed Henry. It was a record of what Henry remembered receiving, then passing forward. The drought of Laura's childhood had nearly taken Mercer Farm. Earl's father and others had helped keep it alive. Henry had spent the decades afterward doing for other families what had once been done for him. And now those families had returned before dawn, not to settle an account, but to continue it. "I thought he kept this farm because he couldn't let go," Laura said. "Earl looked across the pasture. Maybe sometimes he couldn't." Laura appreciated that he did not turn Henry into a saint. She looked toward the drilling rig and the wet ground around the new casing. Finding water had solved only one problem. The drought remained. The herd was still too large for the resources she wanted to risk. The farm still cost money, and Laura still had a life in Wichita. She closed Henry's notebook. For weeks, she had been asking whether Mercer Farm could survive. Now that the answer might be yes, another question mattered more. She had to decide what kind of farm should survive. Laura's first decision was the one Henry would have resisted. She sold part of the cattle herd. The buyer came on a hot morning, and Laura stood beside the corral while animals Henry had raised were loaded for transport. She felt the loss sharply, but when the truck disappeared down the gravel road, she also felt the pressure on the farm's limited water supply ease. Keeping Mercer Farm, she understood, did not require keeping every part of Henry's operation. Her next decision was about the land. Laura had no intention of leaving her payroll job in Wichita and pretending she could suddenly farm 240 acres alone. She arranged to lease part of the workable acreage locally, preserving income without taking responsibility for every field herself. Then she called Nathan Cole. "I'm not selling the whole farm," she told him. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Understood. But I'll discuss a smaller section." They walked the property with maps and numbers. Laura chose acreage that could be separated without giving up the farmhouse. Barn, north pasture, or the core land she associated most strongly with Mercer Farm. Nathan offered a fair price. Laura negotiated rather than accepting from gratitude or fear, and the eventual sale gave her enough reserve to cover her share of the new well, future maintenance, and unexpected farm expenses without threatening her retirement savings. Ben reviewed the figures with her. "Grandpa might complain." "Your grandfather complained professionally," Ben smiled. "He'd still know the math works." The drilling crew returned to complete the well properly. The casing was secured, the well capped, the water tested, and a pump installed. Lines connected the new source to the farmhouse system and livestock troughs. Laura watched the first clean water enter a trough while several cattle approached cautiously and began drinking. She had imagined that moment differently. She thought there might be celebration, perhaps even rain breaking across the horizon like some reward for endurance. There was none. The pond remained low. The fields were still dry. Drought conditions continued across the region. The new well simply provided enough water for the smaller operation Laura had chosen to maintain, provided it was managed carefully. That was enough. She returned to Wichita when work required her there, and came back regularly to Red Willow. She arranged practical local help for the farm rather than assuming she could handle everything from two places. Ben visited when he could and used his mechanical skills on equipment that needed attention. But Laura never suggested Mercer Farm would someday become his responsibility. "You get to decide what your life is," she told him one afternoon. "I wish Grandpa had said that to you," Ben replied. Laura considered it. Maybe he thought he did. In Henry's office, she began organizing the weathered notebook Earl had returned. She added a page recording the recent drought and the names of those who had helped prepare the new well site: Earl, Maria, Calvin, Ben, and the neighboring families who had contributed labor, fuel, machinery, hauling, or money. Earl noticed the page one morning. "Henry never kept score," he said. "Neither am I." Laura closed the notebook gently. "I'm remembering where the water came from." Earl nodded as though that distinction mattered. Over the following months, Laura understood something else about Henry. His mistake had not been loving Mercer Farm too much. It had been believing at times that preserving it meant resisting change. Laura could honor what he protected without reproducing every choice he made. Mercer Farm was smaller now. Fewer cattle grazed its pasture. Someone else worked part of its acreage under lease. A section no longer belonged to the family at all. Yet the farmhouse remained. The barn remained. And the north pasture still held the place where an old, failed well had led them toward a new one. Most importantly, the farm no longer depended on Laura risking everything to prove she deserved to keep it. Months after the drilling, the Drought still had not fully released Red Willow. One evening, Laura was at the farmhouse when her phone rang. A neighboring family had developed pump trouble. Repairs were expected, but not immediately, and their temporary water supply was running low. Laura looked through the kitchen window toward the barn, then beyond it toward the new well. She asked how much water they needed and checked that the amount could be supplied without exceeding what Calvin had recommended for responsible use. "Bring your tank," she said. "We can cover you until the repair is done." Ben was visiting that evening. When Laura told him, he glanced toward Henry's notebook on the table. "Want me to write down what they owe?" Laura knew he was partly teasing, but the question carried 40 years of family history inside it. She opened the notebook, looked at Henry's sentence on the inside cover, and then closed it again. "No, just write down who needed water." The truck arrived near sunset, pulling a temporary tank. Ben connected the hose while Laura checked the flow. Water moved steadily from Mercer Farm's new well into the neighbor's tank. Nobody pretended it was free in some magical sense. Electricity cost money. Pumps wore out. Fuel had to be bought. Wells required testing and maintenance. The Drought remained capable of taking more than any family could easily replace. Laura understood those limits better than Henry sometimes had, and she intended to respect them. But limits did not require indifference. She stood beside the tank as the level rose and remembered the trucks she had seen in this same yard when she was a child. She had once believed those men were hired workers. Now she knew they had come because Henry needed water and could not save Mercer Farm alone. Years later, Henry had hauled water for Maria's family. He had loaned equipment, worked Earl's land, and helped other farmers through their own difficult seasons. Then, when his daughter stood on the same dry ground, facing the same fear, those acts had returned not as debts, but as people arriving before dawn. The tank reached the agreed amount. Ben shut the valve, and Laura watched the truck pull away toward another struggling farm. Behind her, the new well continued pumping within its safe limits. A well could belong to one piece of land, but when someone desperately needed what it provided, Laura finally understood that water could belong to a community.